We are lucky to have Dr. Claire Wolfteich here from Boston School of Theology. So I'm just going to read a few things about her. She is a professor of practical theology and spirituality studies at Boston School of Theology, president of International Academy of Practical Theology. She was past president of the Association of Practical Theology and past and present board member of a lot of academic societies. And that's going to be one of our questions that we come back to. And she's also the co-director for the Center for Practical Theology. And that, maybe we'll start there. Unless, do you want to add anything to that, Dr. Wolfteich, in terms of an introduction? Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I'd love to just, nope, happy to just have some conversation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's talk about this, your job as the co-director for the Center for Practical Theology. And it's interesting because we get to talk to somebody who's kind of in the midst of a big research project. And so for us who are in the Doctorate of Practical Theology, here we get to see this intersection of practical theology and research. So can you tell us a bit more about that project? Even like how it came to be about?
Sure. Yeah, so our Center for Practical Theology at Boston University School of Theology was founded in 2005. And my colleague Brian Stone and I kind of co-created this in conjunction with a Lilly Endowment grant that really fostered the development of our PhD program here in practical theology. So we have benefited from having this center within the School of Theology now for almost 20 years rather. And I will say that's been very helpful, and the fact that we've had a succession of Lilly grants. I just want to put that in there as we think about sort of the discipline of practical theology and how we kind of establish the discipline in different academic contexts. For us here in a university, I think it was helpful to have a center, and it was helpful to have research grants that allowed us to work with communities of faith, but also to do research. And that's really how we've seen practical theology as kind of a bridge between the resources of the academy and the wisdom, the insights, the questions of live persons and faith communities. So I've really loved, working in this field. I mean, a little biography. I did my graduate work at University of Chicago, and if you know the name Don Browning, in practical theology, he was my advisor. I don't know if I realized when I entered the PhD program in practical theology there, they were going to close that program down right after I entered it. So I was the last person in that program at Chicago. But simultaneously, I had strong interest in spirituality, and that was also a really good place to study mysticism and other areas of spirituality. So when this job came up at BU, it was in practical theology and spirituality, and a really nice fit in both of those areas. The Center for Practical Theology then has developed these different research projects, and our current one is called Creative Callings. It's actually a response to a Lilly Endowment call for proposals for an initiative called Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose. And the idea is, how do we build communities of calling? How do we think about innovative ways to imagine calling today and to cultivate ministries that will help people to discern and embody their calling? So that was in 2017. We responded to a call for proposals. We did a planning grant, and then we did we got the full grant. And part of our work was to found an innovation hub of about 12 congregations, mostly in the New England area, who had an interest in this. And we have done sort of micro grants to those congregations, but we've also seen it as part of our calling as a university-based school of theology to do research. So part of that has been basically learning alongside our congregations. What does it look like to build a community of calling? What does that even mean? What are some fresh images for calling in communities today? What are some discernment practices that are not only personal, but even at a congregational level? What would that look like? So we've kind of been gathering, from annual reports and a yearly interview with our congregations, hub events, small group discussions, trying to gather reflections on these things. And then, of course, COVID hit. And so everything changed. Our congregations couldn't do a lot of the innovative projects that they had imagined for themselves, or at least not in the same way that they imagined. They couldn't gather in person. They certainly couldn't, build a music school, which is one congregation's dream. And simultaneously, of course, everything changed in the academy as well. So some things slowed, some things kind of paused, but simultaneously, I think the research questions bubbled up of, well, what is this looking like? Like, what are vocational pauses like? And are they opportunities for deeper discernment? Are they simply impediments to living out our callings? What are vocational pivots when circumstances arise that are unexpected? So we've sort of, tried to think contextually, I guess, about what we're learning from the project. And now in the next 2 years of our grant, I just really want to extend that with our congregations, think about sustainability going forward, and also think about how we really bring what we're learning more and more into our school and our formation of our students here in terms of going out to ministry, going out to teach. I teach a course on vocation also, so there's a nice natural way to integrate some of what's happening in the grant project and some teaching and formation at the school. So I'll pause there. That's a little bit about the project. Happy to go further if anything. Yeah.
Why, what do you think makes it difficult for congregations to know their calling? So that's one question. And then what do you think leaders need to know in order to help a congregation figure out their calling?
Yeah, I think a lot of our language around calling has often been on a very individual level, in terms of, helping individuals to discern a calling. To be honest, I'm a little bit unclear still as to whether it makes sense to talk about a congregational vocation or how that differs from mission. That's something I'm still sort of thinking about, but I think the word calling has spoken on the congregational level. And let me name one other complexity before I sort of get right to answering the question. I think another complexity that I feel in the grant project is that it's very difficult to discern how much of a congregation you're hearing from. In other words, we are hearing a lot from the leadership team that's participating in our hub. And that's about 5 people per congregation. So some of the congregations are doing much deeper work with all of their people. And many of them may not have the same ownership of the project in the congregation as a whole. So I think the question you're asking is really good, because even what we're learning still has to address that question of whose voices are we hearing? But some of the ways that congregations have tried to get at that, some have had discernment circles. One congregation whose project I really think is important is a congregation, an African-American congregation that has a project called Find Your Calling, Fund Your Breakthrough. And it addresses the fact that callings are not always accessible, even once they're discerned. So how might congregations not only foster discernment practices, but actually address those impediments, some of which are financial, to living out a calling once one discerns it? So this congregation took money that we were able to grant and did then discernment circles followed by micro grants or seed grants, so that once people had discerned a next step in their calling, there was at least a little bit of seed money, for example, to take a class if they've discerned nursing as a calling that they feel drawn to, or maybe it's not a career change, but they feel, called to grow their creative work. There may be ways in which funding can actually just be helpful to create opportunities and resources. So I think that congregation is doing something important in naming and addressing some of the, just the structural and financial impediments. We have other congregations that have enlisted spiritual director to kind of work with their congregation. Some are doing anti-racism work, and they've had a theological consultant or other consultants come in to help. Some have, for some it's the worship that's really a central place of formation, and so the discernment of who are we together may happen partly in and through worship. I think COVID was a real challenge in part to not be able to gather bodily, although we're here in person. I hate to use the word, we're not in person, we are in person. But, some congregations lamented the fact that they lost members. Sometimes it was older members of the congregation for whom the technology was just too daunting. Others don't know who's in the congregation because some may still be joining in hybrid worship, but they're not showing up in person and we just don't know. So that's been an issue. Another congregation, this is Harvard Epworth in Cambridge, connected or very close to Harvard University. They focused, in terms of discernment in the congregation, they focused on using technology to really reach more of the younger adults who are a mainstay of their congregation, and doing sort of discernment inventories of gifts and things like that, finding that technology is just more and more important, particularly for that population. And because those congregants are often also students, they're more transitory. So they found it helpful to also think about, like, who are the alums or the dispersed members of our congregation? Maybe they aren't physically in Cambridge anymore, but maybe we might maintain a connection to them even beyond graduation. So I'd say those are some of the means, conversation, discernment circles, prayer, worship together, sort of inventories of gifts. Those are some of the means. I'll just name one other example. We have a congregation that's quite small and has actually been discerning how to end well. They feel that their time, the life of their congregation has come to an end, and they were extremely intentional about integrating spiritual practices and discernment in those questions of how do we care for our remaining members while we think about next steps, and how do we use our resources, and how do we partner with groups, and how do we send people out to good spiritual homes. And they actually requested chairs that they could move into a circle for this discernment, rather than trying to do it in pews where they, were looking at someone's back. So I thought that was an interesting attention to physical space and discernment.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting that your project was timed with COVID, that these two things came together at the same time, because maybe in a way it's like every congregation is kind of wondering, who are we and what are we going to be and do. So thinking about pastors right now, because I think pastors are in a bit of a tight spot. Any words of like encouragement or advice in terms, like just thinking a lot of the practical theology students, may end up as pastors one day. And now I think coming out of COVID, it's like, what would you say to pastors who are kind of in the midst of maybe even having new congregations or congregations they don't really know?
One of the things we've really noticed is the exhaustion. And I also am very interested in practices of Sabbath and theologies of Sabbath. So we've actually brought that in and highlighted that for our pastoral teams and kind of thinking about spiritual sustainability. Finding spaces of lament, naming exhaustion, burnout, as well as, some have found that there was a pause that actually was a bit renewing for some of our pastors, but for many, the ramp up to online worship was a huge stressor. And I guess one of the key pieces I might just name is take care and think about renewal practice. What are practices that would be life-giving for you, renewal for you, safe spaces where you can share experience with others in leadership, finding ways to not gloss over the loss and the pain and the trauma that some have experienced, some communities, some pastors have experienced, but really being able to lament was something that came up, grief was something that came up, and also celebrations. So we kind of tried to focus on both of those for our pastors. Where do you find spiritual sustenance? Where are you tired? Just giving some space even to name that question. Where can you rest? Many of our pastors found that their volunteer teams are really depleted. So they're stressed and their capacity is stressed. So one thing we struggle with a little bit with a grant is like having money often means you have to do something. You have to do something with this money or for this money, and there's accountability for that. And so many of our pastors have felt like they have to start new programs and they don't have a lot of energy to start new programs. So we're trying to think a little bit more of sort of reframing calling, not only as sort of activity, or certainly not as program, but as, a way of being in the world in relationship to a holy creator. And so finding those places to be, and to emphasize that as sort of the ground of any activity or ministry, starts with that. So it's easy for all of us to lose touch with that, I think, as in the busyness, but I think giving permission for that to be the center of ministry rather than sort of everything that we do.
Yeah. Do you think lament and celebration can kind of coexist? I'm thinking of like Mary Clark Michela's book about joy, about her theology of joy, and how she says she found out that her students had this great theology of suffering, but they didn't really know how to navigate joy. So it's interesting to hear you say, this idea of celebration, because I think we've heard a lot about lament, but this idea of celebration is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I definitely think that they can coexist, and the celebration is probably more authentic if you've been able to also name the lament. But I definitely think that they can coexist. Some of our congregations are really interested in the arts and music, and so music has been an important place of celebration. Celebrating health, celebrating normalcy, or touches of normalcy. I think one of the challenges is that everyone isn't in the same place in terms of how they are re-entering. So where one person feels like they're ready to celebrate everything being back to normal, someone else is still confined and vulnerable. And so that's been a challenge. But it's funny you say that about joy, because I was just reading a little bit of Dorothy Day in class, and there are spaces where she's talking about the joy of childbirth and the joy of being with creation and being a co-creator. She's very, celebrating the birth of her daughter at that point. And I do think that sometimes joy is more muted in a lot of spiritual autobiographies, and there is a lot on suffering, but just that unadulterated joy that she expressed was really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thinking about pastors at this time, wouldn't it be great if, if we could live that way at this time? Is there any particular stories you want to tell from the Creative Calling project? You've told a few already, but I just wanted to give you a chance. Is there any other kind of interesting ones about congregations finding their calling that you'd like to share?
I think those were definitely some important ones. We do have, the work of racial justice has been important to several of our congregations. Some of them are grappling with, a history that's implicated with slavery and other racist pasts. And so we actually have one congregation that has felt that it's been very clear, or at least the leadership team has been very clear, that this is a center of their calling. And they are actually engaged in the discussion about reparations and have actually used some of the grant money that we have awarded to them to do reparations within their own congregation. So that's a pretty striking example of a community that I think really, I think they really have seen this as at the core of their Christian faith, and are kind of providing leadership in this area. It's a UCC congregation, and some of that has also spilled out to the denomination, I think, in terms of doing that. Another example, this is one that I found very interesting. This is not so much a congregation, but it's something called Creche, which is an Episcopal co-housing organization in the Boston area. And they have at least 3 intentional communities that they have formed for co-housing. And if you picture, a religious movement like that, hospitality is at the core of their practices. So picture under COVID, what hospitality, how complicated the practice of hospitality gets. So that they're part of our hub, and they, were very clear about their calling as an organization as we entered. Their vocation kind of shifted as they did have to grapple with very complicated questions about, for example, can you just open the doors of a house and let anyone in? And what about some people within the house who have medical needs or other needs and they need to take precautions? And one of their houses actually had a lot of conflict and ended up closing. But in the course of thinking about calling together, they actually made an important shift from thinking about the calling of each individual house to the calling across the houses. And they developed a covenant that expresses their calling as a movement, as an organization. And they've partnered with some Episcopal parishes as well. So they actually have like a document that they that's now a touchstone for them as they think about calling, and that was also pretty important for them. And just one further short glimpse is another one of our congregations thought that they were going to do discernment circles as their project, and then during the pandemic, they totally shelved that. They said, we can't do that, but what our community needs is a food ministry. And they have developed this incredibly rich and complicated food ministry that became also, it really fed their own community because it gave volunteers a way to participate together safely, driving food places or allowing for safe pickups of food. And it really, they discovered a calling that they didn't think that they had before. And it was it's contextual, right? It's based on the needs of the community. So yeah, so that's been wonderful to kind of see that develop.
Mhm. And I'm guessing it's a tricky time for congregations when callings change or when they're in that transition of a new calling too.
Mm.
And maybe that's what COVID's been like for a few churches.
Yes, yeah, I definitely think so. And everyone may not be equally involved in the sort of identification of where the congregation goes, but yeah, I think it's tricky, but it's also brought some new life to some of our congregations to be open to, this is not about a program. This is about walking in the Spirit as the world is changing. And what are we called to now? Sort of adding that now has
Yeah.
been helpful. What are we called to now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to have questions at the end, so people may come back with questions about this project. But I also want to take this chance to talk with you about your work in the area of women and mothering and spiritual autobiographies. So maybe let's start with women's work. This is a complex topic. Wondering where you think we've made progress, like theologically, practically, and where do you think we still need, like what things do we still need to address?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess first we might want to ask who's the we. So different traditions probably have particular needs or areas, and some are, in different places on this question. So I don't know, Elizabeth, if you have a particular tradition in mind or just sort of more generally on the topic.
Why don't we say kind of evangelical Protestant?
Okay, so you might be able to speak to that a little bit more than I can. But so I'm coming out of the Catholic tradition, and we might share some similarities on that point. So maybe I'll speak a little bit more from what I know better, and open up if people might also have more to say. I think what has changed is more expansiveness about the kinds of work that women may be called to. So in my tradition, and I do think this is similar to the evangelical Christian tradition, there's been a strong appreciation for women's mothering roles, for women's domestic callings. And in some ways, I do think that has been very affirming of labor that is otherwise invisible. It's potentially invisible, it's not paid, it's not market work. So sometimes it kind of falls under the radar of theologies of work. But I do think that evangelical Christianity has affirmed that calling, and Catholicism has as well. The challenge is that it sometimes has affirmed it to the detriment of a wider diversity of ways in which calling can be expressed in work. I'll put it that way, because I don't want to equate calling and work, but work is a manifestation of calling. So I think that there's more educational opportunities, more work opportunities for women in different fields, means more opportunity to bring their diverse gifts to a variety of spheres, to exercise their own capacities, to develop them. So I think that is a positive. I think where we're still, wrestling with the vocational strains of trying to do now maybe even more in terms of paid work or careers. And still, for many women, domestic callings are very meaningful. So how to do both? I think there's certainly been some increases in social support and in theologies of family that emphasize more mutuality and caretaking and things like that. But there's still a lot of literature on women's time poverty, the disparities in income, disparities in time availability, the second shift, things like that. I think the volunteer labor in the church is still heavily female. So the question of sort of, I think, giving more still attention to unpaid labor and who's doing it within the church, within the home, in civic spheres, schools, who's in the PTG, all of that is time and energy. And so there's still certain expectations, I think, for the giving that does exert some vocational strain. And so there's, definitely need for more support, I think. Yeah, so I'll pause there and others may want to jump in there.
Yeah. Can I ask you about, because you've done lots of writing on spiritual autobiographies, can you tell us how you got there, like what led you there, and kind of some of the things that you're excited about in terms of that area?
About autobiography?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I began my work in spirituality with a lot of interest in lay spirituality and sort of what's a secular calling or what's a calling in the world. And I'm really interested partly in autobiography as a way to explore that and to access voices that may not be as represented in some of the canons of theology. I'm very interested in women's religious experience, and I think autobiography or life writing more broadly is just a fascinating sort of window into that. It's also a window into how we interpret our experience and how we navigate lots of different things. So for me, being in practical theology, I think autobiography and spiritual autobiography is a wonderful source for gaining access to lived religious experience and sort of lay theologies as people try to make sense of their own lives. And it's not only autobiography is not only the relating of experience, right, but it's also the construction of a self or the representation of a self and a life. So I find that interesting to just the sort of narrative aspect and the aspect of writing itself as a practice, as a spiritual practice, as a means of testimony, or even a means of discernment. Like I often get more clarity as I write rather than sort of getting to my clarity before I write. So writing sometimes helps to make things more clear. And I'm also interested in the variety of different forms of writing. So I think a lot of things related to spirituality are not expressed as well sometimes in prose, and we need poetry, we need art, we need music to try to get at some of the richness of experience or the layers of experience. So I love bringing in the arts in my class. And today I had a student who wrote a blackout poem using like lines from different autobiographies that we'd read and creating one poem out of it. I've asked them to choose a piece of art to illustrate an autobiography that we've read, just to open up again a juxtaposition of image and text and sort of think about that more broadly. But in general, I just think autobiography, it's by no means like the only theological source. I don't think it can be, but I think it gives some access to sort of lived experience in an interesting way.
Yeah, and often the spiritual autobiographies we read are, kind of a select few. So this idea of writing and lay spirituality, it's a window into something that we haven't really done a lot of study on. Yeah. Let me ask you about. Okay, how are we for time? Okay, I want to ask you about your participation in all these different academic societies over the years. So I want to know what compelled you to get involved, kind of what are the benefits of being involved, and what would you say to practical theology students about potentially becoming involved in some of these societies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I've been involved in a number of organizations in the practical theology and the spirituality worlds, and I definitely recommend getting involved. Judging the time commitment that makes sense at a particular stage in someone's work. But I think organizations like, for me, the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality has been a really collegial organization, as has Association of Practical Theology, where it's a chance to meet people who are writing books that you might be reading and actually have conversation and sort of just to encounter people as real people. I think that's a really nice thing. It's a way of, listening to papers and thinking about the future of a field. So not only, what you're receiving, but also beginning to think of how you're contributing to a discipline. And you do that in a community. So often there are opportunities for emerging scholars to participate or have leadership in some of these organizations, because that is the future of the discipline. And so that's really important. So there can be like a conversation across different stages of career. And that can be super helpful as you're discerning where you'd like to go. And also sometimes seeing pitfalls of what, mistakes people make as they advance. Or you get advice, you get mentoring sometimes. And yeah, I think it's very helpful. I think because practical theology is interdisciplinary, one of the challenges is that there might be more organizations that you could potentially join than you really have time to join. So for me, I've sort of honed in on American Academy of Religion, the Spirituality Society, the International Academy of Practical Theology, the Association of Practical Theology, and the Catholic Theological Society of America. So, you want to think about sort of what would, in a way, your membership and your leadership in those organizations represent a bit of how you locate yourself as a scholar. So you want to think about that. And maybe a pastoral organization is also important for some of you. And, so I'd say just for the nourishment of scholarship, it's helpful for mentoring, for networking, for feeling like you are part of a community and you're not just reading books. That's very useful. But also figuring out your time commitment, not getting sucked into leadership because they need someone to do a job like fix the website, and that's going to take hours and hours. And, you have to think about, well, what's good for the organization and what's good for you at a particular point in your own work too.
Yeah. Okay, so for a practical theology student who's maybe thinking about, doing their first presentation at a conference or submitting their first article to a journal, that can be a scary thing. What would you say?
Yeah, I think actually a group like you all have here, first of all, is a wonderful thing. So you can try out paper proposals together, swap them around, find out like 2 or 3 conferences maybe that that you might all want to be thinking about. And maybe, we actually have, as part of a practical theology doctoral course, have students identify conferences that they might present a paper at, even if they never do. And, I suggested write a proposal, even if you never submit it. Just start practicing writing a proposal. And how do you write a good, sharp proposal in whatever number of words they allow you to do? So I think using your community here is helpful. And I would suggest probably linking a paper presentation to something that you're working on. Because sometimes people, say, oh, that call for proposal sounds great. I'd like to write something on that. And it has nothing to do with maybe your dissertation or your coursework. And sometimes that can really steer you can slow you down a lot.
Oh,
But
okay.
if you're presenting on something related to what you're doing, you also have your advisor giving you, feedback on what you're writing, and the feedback that you get in presenting may also help you to write better.
Mhm.
So I just really encourage people to move through their programs too, and not get too slowed down at an earlier stage. You want to complete the program. So I would ask, is it helpful to me to present at this stage? Do I have something to say? Will I be able to handle questions on this topic? Can I get my advisor to read a proposal before I submit it and give me a little bit of feedback? Can this group do the same? If you have a paper accepted, definitely figure out what's the time allotment for the paper. I'd say one of the biggest errors that people make is they have too much material, and they have 20-minute slot and they have like 40 minutes worth of material. And it's terribly hard if you're up there to get the 5-minute warning and realize you have to cut 10 pages on the spot, and you get flustered and it's not good. So you want to know what's your time allotment and prepare and practice it so that it fits in that time allotment. People will thank you. People do not want you to go 20 minutes over your time allotment. So I mean, get out there. It helps. The more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it. But also, I wouldn't do it unless it's helpful to you at this stage, at a particular stage.
Yeah, good. We've got 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, you can either just unmute and ask, or you can use the little hand raising thing too.
Claire, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, go ahead,
sorry.
John.
I don't know who just said that, but yeah, sorry. Sorry, Claire. Thanks for joining us. It was really interesting. I've been trying to follow the project for a little bit since I heard about it, because it's sort of it matches some of the things that are happening in Hamilton amongst our congregations, and so thank you for sharing about it today. I have a question about this sort of spiritual autobiography, and whether you've seen anything or thought about how that spiritual autobiography sort of correlates to the autoethnographic method for research, which is a broad question. It's sort of leaving it open there, but I'm interested in the method, and so I'm wondering if you've done anything of that or seen anything.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think autoethnography is probably most advanced in the British context. And there's been some interesting writing by, for example, Elaine Graham on that. I would not say that we're really there yet in terms of BU School of Theology really adopting autoethnography. I think it would be more common for people to be analyzing spiritual autobiographies than incorporating their own experience methodologically into a practical theology dissertation. It's probably a bit more common in our doctor of ministry program to incorporate that, to incorporate more of that. We definitely do encourage sort of locating oneself in a piece of scholarship. So you will see that as a piece of sort of the method or the location of the scholar, but not, I wouldn't say, I can't remember a dissertation yet that we've had that would represent autoethnography here. I'd be curious in the Canadian context whether there's more energy around that or more interest in that or acceptance of it.
Hey, Claire, thank you again for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to kind of invite you just ask a question about kind of thinking about being a practical theologian. But as I was listening to you talk about the work with your congregations work, I was wondering if that's something you would have saw yourself doing when you started your doctorate at Chicago, if that was something you would have seen, or how has your career evolved? And while most of the people here tonight are still in the throes of preparing to write or writing a dissertation. They're not thinking too far maybe down the road about what's next. But how has your career evolved, and how can you reflect a little bit on once you finish? I always say to my students, finishing your Doctor of Practical Theology isn't an ending point, it's a beginning point, because you're going to go on from there and do other things. So maybe reflect. I don't know if that's a bit of a statement, but there's a question in there somewhere that maybe you can untangle a little bit.
Yeah, that is such a good question. It's actually not one that we're asked very often, right? But it's so helpful to reflect on how we got where we are and what's next for us too. And no, I don't think I would have quite envisioned this, although I have to say that I did go into practical theology. I did the Master of Divinity first. And as a Catholic laywoman, I found that very beneficial, but I also wasn't sure sort of what my opportunities in ministry were going to be within the church. And so I did go into the PhD in practical theology in part because I saw that as a way to bring together intellectual interests in religion and spirituality with my interest in ministry. But where that would go, I didn't know. And I do think there's a little bit of like vocational irony kind of in where I've wound up, in that I'm in a largely Protestant school of theology doing a lot of pastoral and spiritual formation. I'm not eligible to be ordained in my own tradition. So it's there's a little bit of irony in this. But also I really landed in a place where I just feel like all like my love of the church can be nourished and can find a place. My interest in continuing to read spirituality and to be nurtured in my own spiritual life. You're fed when you're teaching a subject over and over, you get to immerse yourself in it. And if I weren't doing this work, I hope I would, but I don't know if I would to the depth that I do now. I love teaching, so I have that aspect. So it actually kind of fills a lot of the things that brought me into practical theology in the first place. That idea of, not losing touch with faith communities. I think that was very important to me, and not losing touch with sort of everyday lived experience. And I struggled with that at points in my graduate work, of feeling like theology was getting more and more abstract. God was more and more of an idea and not, a relationship. And I just longed to hold on to, I guess, some of that and go deeper in that area. So in a way, I feel like I've been really, really fortunate to wind up in this work. And there's a lot of creativity in it. You can constantly sort of redesigning classes. Every class session can be new. You have new students. Your connection with the churches is sustained. So no, I didn't imagine precisely the form it took, but I did have impulses toward this integration of church, spirituality, intellectual work, writing, that has come to fruition. I think if you're starting out, having a continual sense of discernment at each point in the program is helpful. Like I actually just talked with our PhD students about this tonight, like thinking about what courses you want to take next semester. That's discernment. You're thinking about what are the fields you're building and bringing together, thinking about what to write a prospectus on. That's discernment. Thinking about your writing and how to balance that with the rest of your life. Is you're setting up habits and practices for a life. And I mean, not that everything can be done at every moment. There are seasons in calling, but I think thinking like flexibly in your imagination about where your calling might take concrete form, while trying to, follow what you think is where you're being led at a particular moment. yeah, that, it's something, it's a great question, Lee, because often we talk about discernment like I'm discerning here forward. And often it's not that way at all. It's discerning backward, where you're or seeing the path that has formed from a retrospective perspective, having some vaguer impulses that are leading you forward, but not like, oh, I want to someday be at BU School of Theology leading a grant project from the Lilly Endowment. That's, yeah, too specific to have been in my purview.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for being with us. This is really interesting. I'm wondering if you could to go back to something that you mentioned right at the beginning when you talked about a congregation's calling and mission. Can you speak more to like the difference between those two things, or are they interchangeable when you think about a congregation's calling versus mission?
Yeah, I'm still thinking through that question. Mission is a sending out. I think calling, my instinct is that calling is a more fundamental phenomenon or experience, or it's, you're called to follow Christ. There are certain ways of being, I guess, that we're called to, and mission might be a more specific manifestation of that, but I'm not exactly sure yet. I think calling might leave a little bit more room for the sort of the Sabbath practices, for being rather than doing, not in a dichotomizing way, just as the ground, as the who we are, not just what we're doing or what we're sent out to do, but more fundamentally who we are and with whom we're in relationship, being sort of the calling. But I'm still thinking about this, yeah. Because I think in popular language, some do think of them interchangeably. Some have a mission statement and they might feel like, well, that expresses our calling. Maybe it does. So I'm still thinking about it.
Thank you. Uriah, do you have a question?
Yeah, and you've actually sort of addressed some of what I was thinking, but I love your comment. Or, by the way, thank you for sharing. It's been a wide range of topics, and that's been delightful. I do love your comment that that calling is not about activity, not just about activity or programming, but about being. And I think that is so important, and it kind of ties to the notion that being comes before mission in some respects. So we're called to who we are to be in order to go do, perhaps. So I'm intrigued and fascinated by that proposal. So maybe you could comment a little bit more, or even if you have examples of maybe within the project, some examples of where the discernment led to being as a prerequisite to the doing aspect of it.
Yeah, I do think it is a little bit complicated again with grants, because I don't know if you need a grant to be right. So there is a little bit of a pressure. But some of it is we have tried to give some permission to what do you need to renew? What do you need for your own selves? When we talk about sustainability, sometimes that language is like, okay, how are we going to do more of what we're doing, or how are we going to do it longer or better? And we're trying to say, what do you first need as people to be sustained? So like one congregation did a retreat for their leadership team. That is still a kind of a doing, but it's also receiving. And for some, it meant very practically, they really needed to hire some staff. They needed to at least get some part-time help. And we saw that as something worth supporting, in part because not to do more necessarily, but to share, to take some pressure off the pastor in particular. So again, I do think it's a little bit complicated with a grant. Same with like an academic sabbatical. You don't get it to Sabbath. You get a sabbatical usually to write another book. And so there's always that productivity edge. And I'm still trying to figure out how you sort of resist that. Even, you know, you're going to write a book about Sabbath. Well, that's productive and it's Sabbath. So what, you know, it's everything gets jumbled a little bit because of our culture, because this is what we're, you know, this is how we accord value. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Performativity drives academia and so much of ministry as well. Thank you. Thank you for your insights.
Sean, do you want the last question? I mean,
Dale,
Dale,
yeah.
sorry, Dale.
Close enough. You talked about the idea. Not really, but okay. Do you want my glasses? You talked about the idea of theology has gotten, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but very philosophical instead of practical. And you also talked earlier about lament and joy. So my project is on, my dissertation is on Pentecostal clergy and who've went through trauma. And basically I bring up the idea that Pentecostals have no, we're always in a joy, or not a joy, a victory mode. Whereas, like, you know, you can't speak a negative because that's overcome. Yet we look at the Psalms and they're, a third of them are Psalms of lament. We look at all Lamentations and it's basically the whole thing is, and Job, the whole thing is that God, you've done me wrong. Yet we have this hard time saying that to God because we have this philosophical idea of God can't be spoken against or theological or praxis. And yet I find it very interesting that you bring it back to joy, but some traditions, mine, wouldn't have an avenue to get to joy because we don't know how to grieve or lament. So I guess my question is, how would you encourage people to get that lament stage that aren't typical or typically used to lamenting? Like Pentecostals, most evangelicals, I'd say, aren't used to lamenting.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I mean, others in the group here may have more insight into that. I think smaller groups may be a safer place, first of all, to start naming pain. I think sometimes it's hard in a, you know, like a large worship service to ask people to name their pain. May be too, you know, may be a harder context. Maybe if there were small group ministries within the congregation, that would be an easier place. Place of mutuality, like in my autobiography course, the students are writing excerpts of their own autobiographies and then they share those in small groups. So everyone's doing the same practice. And often there's a lot of lamenting and a lot of suffering that's named in that. So sometimes starting with personal experience can be helpful, or even including some anonymity. If it is a worship service, you know, having little cards that people can write a lament on that's gathered in a basket, and those are named, where people are a little less vulnerable if it's not as common in the context. But sometimes lament, it may help to sort of, it's the flip side of a gift. We lament something that is lost, perhaps, that was beautiful, or that we long for. You know, there's a good on the other side of lament, and maybe naming that it's not complaining. It's part of human experience. There's pain, there's suffering, and it's sort of how you move through that. But you can't really move past it without acknowledging it. I think just saying that this is really hard too, saying we're not used to this. We don't always have the language for this. Maybe we can try to get language together, and it's okay to stumble over your words. It's okay to try something out, but is there anything that you feel some sadness about today, or you feel some loss about that you want to name because it was beautiful for you? Those are some ideas, but again, your community here may have some better ones.
That's great. Well, our hour is up. So Claire, we just want to thank you for being with us tonight. You're this great combination of practical theology and research and pastoral and spiritual formation, kind of like you've got it all. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really nice to have some conversation with you all and see what you're doing.
Great. Well, thank you. Just a note to our Practical Theology Guild members, because this is also going to be sent out to our list of, I think we've got about 36 people in the guild, so they'll get the link to the recording from tonight. And then just a reminder, our next meeting is January 18th. It's in the evening. Okay, so thank you, Claire, and good night, everyone. And we will see you next time.
Good night. Thanks so much.
Good night, everyone. Thanks again, Claire. See you guys.